Okay, so we are gonna Wednesday morning. We're gonna think about a little bit about the teachings of the Rebbe on the Parsha. I guess today will be on the Parsha, and this is something that is relatively well known. So you may have heard this before, but hopefully we get a little bit more analysis from the perspective of the Rebbe on the commentaries on the Parsha, on the weekly Torah portion. So the weekly Torah portion is about Noach, who, according to the Torah, was the single righteous person in his generation. And there's the flood that wipes everybody out except for Noach, because Noach is a righteous man, completely righteous. The verse says, Noach ish tzaddik, Noach is righteous, tamim, he was complete in his generations. So when you read the text, it seems like Noach was impeccable. There's no critique whatsoever. But then, if you look at the commentaries, you see that it's not so simple. And there's really two sources that point out to Noach being less than perfect, even though the verse says he's tamim, he's complete. And the first, well, there's two there. One is the Zohar. The Zohar is the sort of mystical interpretation of Judaism. And the Zohar says as follows. It says that Noach did not pray for the people of his generation. If God comes to him and the God says, well, there's going to be a flood, Noach goes along with it. He says, okay, you want me to build the ark? I'll build the ark. But there's no record of Noach praying to God to divert the flood and to change the decree. That's the fact that the Zohar points out. And the Zohar contrasts that with Avraham, who, when God comes to him and tells him that he wants to destroy the wicked city of Sodom, we'll read that next week. Abraham protests. He says, how could God destroy the wicked with the righteous? It must be that what would you spare the city if there were 50 righteous people? And God says yes, and then 45, and then 40. The end is there's no 10 righteous people, and sort of Abraham concedes. But at least you see that Abraham tries to to change the decree. And then the Zohar says, and the greater level is even Moses, because what Abraham does is Abraham tells God, would you spare the city, the entire city, for a few righteous people? And God says yes. But when we discover there are no righteous people in Sodom at all, then Abraham ceases his advocacy. However, when it comes to Moses, when the Jewish people sin with the sin of the golden calf, and Moses prays to God and says, he doesn't say, save the wicked Jews on account of the righteous Jews, even though some Jews were righteous, not everybody served the golden calf. But there, Moses says something much greater, says even those who sinned, forgive those who sinned, right? So the idea of praying for the sinners, praying for the people who are less than perfect, praying for the people of the generation is very clear with Moses and to a lesser degree with Abraham, but Noach, there's no record of him praying and praying to God. That is a statement of fact. That's the reality. Now the question becomes, what is the interpretation of that fact? And the Zohar quotes two opinions. There's two sages quoted in the Zohar, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yehuda says, that is the fact, he didn't pray for the people of his generation. But that's not a critique. You can't hold that against Noach. How come? Because when you look at Moses, says Rabbi Yehuda, when you look at Moses, what does Moses say? When Moses tells God, forgive the wicked people, the wicked Jews, even though they serve the golden calf right after the giving of the Torah, 40 days after God says don't serve idols, they serve the golden calf. Moses tells God, forgive the people. Why should God forgive the people? So if you look at those texts, you look at those verses, you see that what Moses tells God is, Zechor la'Avraham li'Yitzchak li'Yaakov. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Remember the patriarchs. In other words, remember the righteousness of the parents, and in the merit of the parents, forgive the children. That's what Moses does. That's his technique. That's his tactic. That's how he advocates for forgiveness. If the people are not worthy, well, they're the descendants of their ancestors who were loyal to you, and therefore God, forgive them because they're the descendants of the patriarchs. So that's Moshe's Moshe's technique. Now, if you look at Noach and you say, why didn't Noach pray for the sinners? Well, what's Noach going to do? They didn't have the merit of the ancestors, of the patriarchs. So Rav Yitzchak says, of course, Noach did not pray for the sinners like Moshe did, but that's no fault of his own. The circumstance is completely different because the people did not have the sin. The people of Noach's generation did not have the merit of the patriarchs of their fathers. So that is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that the fact that Rabbi Yehuda did not, the fact that Noach did not pray for the sinners, that itself is not a critique. That's understood because he didn't have any point to advocate because he could not say, well, look at their ancestors. That's Rav Yehuda. Rav Yitzchak, however, Rav Yitzchak says no. Rav Yitzchak says that despite this reason, despite what Rav Yehuda brings up, despite the fact that you could argue that Noach did not have, that the people of Noach's generation did not have the merit of their ancestors, nevertheless, says Rav Yitzchak, no, the fact that Noach did not pray for the people of his generation, that is something that he should have prayed anyway. So Rav Yitzchak says it is a critique of Noach. So that's what you find in the Zohar. Now we're going to go one extra layer, and that is that we're going to quote the Rebbe's father, who wrote comments on the Zohar, and he was a Kabbalist, and he had a very interesting point because he did this all the time. He basically would say that the reason why two sages could look at the same set of facts and come to a completely different conclusion, in other words, for example, in our case, well, we know Noach did not pray for the people of his generation. Now the question is, was that a good thing or a bad thing? Was this a critique of Noach or not? Is this accusing him of doing something less than perfect? The reason why two sages would argue is because each sage's opinion is influenced by their spiritual makeup. And the Rebbe's father proves, we're not going to get into it right now, that Rav Yehuda, who says it was not a critique of Noach, Rav Yehuda, his spiritual makeup is that of chesed, that of kindness. And therefore, when he looks at Noach, he looks with a kind eye, and he doesn't see it as a critique. Whereas Rav Yitzchak he's made up of the dominant attribute of his personality is discipline and strength, and trying to look at things exactly the way they are and only give to that who is deserving. And therefore, Rav Yitzchak is, because the makeup of his soul is that the attribute of judgment, the attribute of discipline, is much more dominant. So therefore, he looks at Noach with a more of a critical eye. That's that's the Rebbe's father's commentary on the Zohar, the debate between Rav Yitzchak and Rav Yehuda, whether or not Noach should have done something, whether or not the fact that Noach did not pray is a positive or a negative. So that's one thing. Now we want to shift a little bit to show how Rashi himself also brings similar opinions. We want to ask a few questions, get a few answers, and get a lesson. All that in the next few minutes. Go ahead, Vicky.
Yeah, I had a question. Did anybody raise the question that generations were different, comparing in the Noach times and to the Moses times?
Yeah, so that is yeah, there's a Talmudic dispute, and that Rashi quotes, and we're going to get to that in a second. I'm going to read it right away. A similar disagreement. I'm going to quote the Talmud that Rashi quotes, and there Rashi focuses on the word. The verse says, Noach ish tzaddik. Noach was a righteous man, perfect in his generations. Right? So you look at that verse and you see, okay, so where is the critique of Noach? It seems like what we're saying is that Noach is perfect. Okay, let me just open up the verse. Why not? We already have the technology. We may as well use it. right? The technology was created so we can use it, so we may as well use it. The verse says, right? Eila told us Noach, these are the am I in? No, we're not in. Are we in? I don't know. Yeah, we are in. These are the generations of Noach. Noach was a righteous man. He was perfect in his generations. Noach walked with God. So what does it seem to say? It seems to say Noach is perfect. Where can you find any critique? So the sages say, 1 second, what is the word perfect in his generations? So we're going to quick Rashi's commentary, who quotes the Talmud, Sanhedrin 108a, says Rashi, I'm highlighting it right here. Some of the sages interpret it, the word bidorotav, the word in his generations, favorably. In other words, they say the fact that we say perfect in his generations, you could have said Noach was a perfect man. The fact that righteous man, perfect, righteous, perfect man. The fact that you say you qualify it and you say perfect in his generations, that qualifier is that a positive or a negative? So some of the sages say it's a positive. They explain this extra word in a favorable way. What do they say? They say, how much more so if he had lived in a generation of righteous people? He would have been even more righteous, right? You say Noach, even in the generation of Noach, where the entire earth was corrupt, even there he was righteous. If you placed him in another generation where people were more righteous, Noach would be even more righteous. So they say when the Torah says perfect in his generation, what you're doing is you are that qualifier in his generation is actually expanding and adding to a complement of Noach. They interpret this favorably. However, others interpret it derogatorily. They say this is not a compliment. To the contrary, in comparison with his generation, he was righteous. But if he had been in Abraham's generation, he would not have been considered of any importance. So the similar situation where the Zohar has two opinions, Rabbi Yitzchak and Rabbi Yehuda, debating whether or not Noach should have prayed for his generation. Similarly, the Talmud, quoted in Rashi, says when you say Noach, when you classify Noach as a righteous person, perfect in his generation, is that a compliment or is that a derogatory term specifically in his generation? But if he was in other generations, he would be insignificant. So that is sort of two perspectives, both in the Zohar and the Talmud, how to view the story of Noach. Go ahead.
I was just asking if they actually compared the generations, if they were deserving of praying for.
Right. Okay. So not in this context. There are other Hasidic discourses that discussed it mainly. There is another context where it's discussed. Yes. So and the answer is it's not, from the perspective of Hasidism, it's not the same evil, and therefore Noach's generation cannot be transformed. Abraham's could, and therefore Abraham prays for his generation. But that's a different question. That's the question about objective reality. And now we're looking at the personality. In other words, even if I don't know for sure what's the spiritual makeup of the evil around me, the question is, do I try? And here we see that it seems to be saying that there's a dispute. Some people say you should have tried, and some people say you should not have tried because you didn't have any tools to try. Right? That's what Rabbi Yehuda says. Rabbi Yehuda says you can't try, you can't ask God to forgive the people. They don't have any merit. They don't even have the merit of their ancestors. Whereas Rabbi Yitzchak says, no. We're critiquing Noach. You should have tried. And the same thing with his generation. The fact that Noach is less than Abraham. In other words, Noach is perfect in his generation. Is that a good or negative? You have a choice really how to view Noach, how to view the personality of Noach. If you have to write a play of Noach, are you going to say that every time the Torah uses a word, like, for example, his generations, the Torah is going out of its way to amplify his righteousness? Or are you going to say the Torah is telling you, don't paint the perfect picture. The guy is less than perfect. Yeah, compared to the bank robbers, he's perfect, right? That's not necessarily a compliment. Or you could say, even though the entire society is bank robbers, he's perfect. Could you imagine what he would do if the entire society was holy? Oh, he would have been even greater. So it's your choice how you want to read it. Okay. Now, so that's what we're left with from the. If you go back 2,000 years, 1,800 years ago, that's what the literature, the rabbinic literature, leaves us with these two choices of how to look at Noach. But now comes the Rebbe, and the Rebbe says, let's think about this for a second. The law is, the Talmud says, it says in the Ethics of the Fathers, that you should always judge a person favorably. Always judge a person favorably. If I have a choice, if I see you doing something, I have a choice to give a positive interpretation to your actions or a negative interpretation to your actions. If you want to be a pious person, you should judge everybody favorably. That's a lesson of the Mishnah. So now you see, you have a situation, perfect case in point, where you have Noach. You have a choice to judge him favorably or unfavorably. And here we say there's one rabbi, both in the Zohar and in the Mishnah and in the Talmud, that say, well, we have a choice. We're going to judge him unfavorably. Okay, so why are we doing that? Why would you do that? Doesn't that contradict the statement of the Mishnah? You should judge everybody favorably. Question number one. Question number two. Similar question. Why would the Torah amplify and highlight that Noach is less than perfect? In other words, we know that the Torah is not going to, we actually learned it from this week's Parsha. We discussed this in a different essay, in a different talk of the Rebbe, that the Talmud, it's quoted from the Talmud. Talmud says that a person should always speak in a positive language. You should always speak positively, even if it's going to cause you to speak more at length. You need more words to express the same thing. Say something in a positive way. Why? And it quotes this week's parsha, where the verse says, God tells Noach, take from all the clean animals, the animals that are kosher, and the animals that are not pure. Asher einena tahora. Whereas the verse could have said, take the impure animals. There's a word tameh. Tameh means impure, the contaminated. So you could have just said, take two of the contaminated animals. Contaminated is a bad translation. I'm just looking for a word that the word itself implies negativity without having to say unclean. Okay? So the verse says, take 7 animals that are pure, and then from the animals that are not pure, asher einena tahora. 3 words instead of 1 word. The Talmud runs the numbers, and you say they have an additional 11 letters. To say the animal which is not pure, you're adding 11 letters. Says the Talmud, derived from this week's parsha, a person should always speak in positive language. Don't speak negative language, because the Torah goes out of its way to speak positively. If you read the book on the Rebbe from Rabbi Telushkin, so he says the Rebbe was very careful about this. This is accurate, very careful. Like the Rebbe never said, he had all kinds of things. For example, the hospital in Hebrew, a hospital is the house of the sick. Bet cholim, that's how you say hospital in Hebrew. The Rebbe felt if you're going to label it the house of the sick, then the people there are going to think of themselves as sick, and that could affect their health negatively. So the Rebbe went out of his way to refer to it not as the house of the sick, but a house of healing, bet refuah, a hospital as a house of healing. What am I doing here? Because I'm going to heal. Oh, if you're going to heal, that's already positive. You're saying the same thing, but you have a choice to look at it positive or negative. So that's what the Talmud derives. Talmud says the Torah goes out of its way only to speak positive whenever possible. So now you're telling me that the Torah goes out of its way, adds a word, says Noach was righteous in his generation. For what purpose? To tell you, oh, no, Noach was not that great. Why are we going out of our way? We're not going to say we don't want to highlight the negativity of an unkosher animal. Why would you go out of the way to highlight that Noach was less than perfect?
But that raises a question, the linguistics question, whether the negative from the positive is more mild than just a negative word. Maybe it's not always the case.
Right.
But in Rebbe's example, definitely, because he uses it definitely without negative,
right.
healing.
That example is.
Here,
But it's clear the Talmud makes the point. Talmud says, don't say tameh. Say einena tehora. Say that's not pure. So you're in your vocabulary, right? The words you use shape the ideas you think about, and shapes the energy. So if you're saying, you could say death, you could say the opposite of life. What's the difference? The difference is the word life. The word you use is life, right? It's more of a positive word. So spiritually, it fills your life with positivity. Even when you have to talk about something negative, the words you use are positive words. That's what the Talmud says. The Rebbe didn't make it up. Hasidism didn't make it up. The Talmud makes it up. So if the Talmud says it, why is it that the Talmud says the Torah goes out of its way to say, even a non-kosher animal, not to label it as impure, as contaminated, and you say the animal that's not pure. So why are you going out of your way for Noach? So that's easier to deal with. The answer is the Talmud over there makes a caveat and says, unless you're coming to teach a law. When you're coming to teach a law, there's no way to be vague, and you should have to be direct. And therefore, many times when the Torah says a law, the Torah says tameh, the animal is unclean, and the animal is contaminated. In other words, if you're coming to teach a law, you speak direct, even if it's not positive. But in narrative, if you're saying a narrative and you have a choice, so in a narrative, you could say the language, you want to say the language that's cleaner. In other words, a nice language. So in other words, this must be a narrative to us. If you follow the opinion that says that when the Torah says Noach was righteous in his generation, the Torah is here to hint to us that Noach was less than perfect. If it was just narrative, the Torah wouldn't go out of its way to tell us something negative about Noach. We don't do that. But it must be that's a lesson. And the lesson, what could the lesson possibly be for us? So here you have the Rebbe, a very interesting innovation of the Rebbe. What the Rebbe is going to say is that really nobody is disagreeing. We presented a disagreement: is Noach positive, is Noach negative? And then we ask, why would one opinion think of it as negative and the other one positive? So what we're going to try to do is consolidate and say they're not really arguing about Noach. And this is a general rule in the Talmud. I know it's going to sound funny for anybody who has any Talmudic training. It's going to sound funny, but the rule is we don't want to increase disagreements. In other words, if you see a disagreement in the Talmud, then you have a choice to minimize the disagreement or maximize it. You always try to minimize it. We don't want to add disagreement. There's enough disagreement in the Talmud that we don't have to expand it. So if we have a choice to explain a disagreement in a minimal fashion, to say that it's more narrow, the dispute is about something more narrow, we would much prefer to do that. So now let's look at the big picture. What we're going to say is as follows. Everybody agrees that Noach was not as great as Abraham as Moses. No disagreement. Everybody agrees that this is by no fault of his own. No disagreement. Everybody agrees that had he been in the generation of Abraham, he would be greater. No disagreement. Okay, so what are we fighting about? So here, the word that the Talmud uses is, let's see if they translate it properly in the English. Interpreted. Okay, it's not great, but we'll try. Let's look at the Rashi, right? In his generations, some of our sages interpret it, the word B'dorotav, favorably. But if you look at the Hebrew, dorshim. So if you know the word medrash, the word drash is to expound upon. In other words, it's a little bit more removed from the simple interpretation. In other words, what the Rebbe says is like this. The dispute between the two sages of the Talmud, how to interpret the word favorably, is not really about Noach. There's no dispute about Noach. All the facts, everyone agrees. Everyone agrees he's not as great as Abraham. Everyone agrees it's not by no fault of his own. Had he been in the generation of Abraham, he would be greater. There's no dispute. And it's not even a critique. What do you want from the guy? He's not in that generation. He doesn't have the spiritual opportunities of the other generation. So there's no dispute about that. What is the dispute? The dispute is that those who are more critical, what they're saying is what the Torah is telling us is how we should expound that story, how we should view the story of Noach, meaning not what was Noach's spiritual or psychological makeup, but what is the lesson to us? If you want us looking at it from what's the lesson to us, what could we derive from the story, different than what the story is saying, different than the spiritual makeup of Noach himself, but what can I derive from that story? If that's the question, then the way my takeaway should be, not that Noach was unfavorable, but his behavior is unfavorable in our circumstances. Now that we have the experience of Noach and the experience of Abraham, and all the time has passed, and all the opportunity that we have, now when we expound the story of Noach, now says one opinion of the Talmud, and says Rav Yitzchak, we're going to be critical of Noach, meaning for us, the behavior of Noach would be insufficient. But not that it's a critique of Noach. Because then you would have to say, you're going out of your way to critique Noach, leave him alone. If you have a choice to look at it positive or negative, why would you run to say negative? So what we're saying is, we're not critiquing him. Of course, in his situation, that's what he did. Probably, we're going to say he had no choice. But the question becomes, in hindsight, what could we learn from that story? now the question is for us, how do we darsh, in Yiddish you would say darshan, it's a play on the Hebrew word drash. How do we expound the story? In other words, when you read the story of the Torah, there's two stories. There's what happened, that's story number one. What do I learn from the story? It could be different. And just because I could learn that the behavior of Noach is negative, that does not mean that I'm saying that he had a problem. So we're separating, in other words, it's almost like a new way of thinking about how to read the Torah is you have to learn on two planes. What is the story telling us? What happened? And that's a wonderful thing to explore and define. But then separate than that is, how do I apply that to my life? And there could be two, that could divert from the actual story because the actual story is in the context of that story. So that is one of the big ideas here. We have another detail that we have to add, an important detail, but that's one of the big ideas here.
Rabbi, I have a question. How come the previous rabbis who interpreted didn't view it as a lesson to us and were critiquing Noach?
Well, we're going to say that what the Rebbe is going to say is that's what they meant. When the Talmud, right? The reader didn't understand that. When we read the Talmud, we think the Talmud is being critical of Noach. What the Rebbe is saying is, no, you misunderstood the Talmud. Both opinions agree that he was who he was. And that's why the Talmud uses the term, yesh dorshin, to expound this word. The expounding on this word means we're taking it a little away. We're taking it in a different direction. We're taking it to what does it mean for us? And because we're taking it away to a different direction, it's not really a critique of Noach necessarily. In other words, we're critiquing him, but it's not fair. There's a question today. I don't want to get political, but there's a question. Could you judge the morality of a person in the past based on the current moral standards? And this is tearing up the entire America. They want to tear down statues. They want to rename universities, right? Everybody is looking at, there's a question of whether or not we could retroactively make judgments about the people in the past because they're not living up to our standards. So I didn't think about this. It just came to my mind right now. But one way to think about this is you have to differentiate between what they did under those circumstances, which for those circumstances may have been less than perfect, but you can't critique them because they're operating in a certain given situation. But that does not mean that when we read that story, we should say, oh, this guy's a hero. We could say in his generation, he's a hero. And however, the takeaway for us is we should not be like him. You see, so you see, this thing is very relevant. The ability to have the what's the word I'm looking for? To have the complexity to understand that the person may have been righteous in his generation, and that may have been positive for him, but for us, we're going to expound it negatively, meaning for us, that behavior would be insufficient. For that person, maybe it was sufficient. Again, I don't want to get into the specific of people because then you say, were they righteous in their generation? That's another whole discussion. But the ability to separate the idea of, could we look at somebody and judge them based on their times and say, for their times they were positive, for us they're negative. In other words, for us, we expound from what we know today. We're going to look at the story and say, the takeaway for us is, don't be like Noach. Even though Noach, he's righteous in his generation. And for his circumstances, he was perfect. But for us, the takeaway is, don't be like Noach. We can have both those stories simultaneously because there's two stories. There's a story of Noach himself and the story of what's the takeaway for us. Okay, that wasn't bad. That wasn't bad. To be able to apply it to the current events without stepping on too many minefields. Right? I know that. And Ken and Lillian have a grandson at Princeton, and I think in Princeton there's a whole controversy with one of their schools is named for President Wilson, I think, unless I'm confusing. And there's a whole to do if they should change his name, they shouldn't change his name. Now, again, I don't know much about, I'm not an expert on this field, so I'm not going to be the one to say what they should do. But I do think that you need to be able to see at least what the model here is. That you judge the person according to his generation. That doesn't mean that for us we should do the same, but saying that we should do the same doesn't mean you're taking away from the righteousness of him and his generation. So in that sense, that's a more of a complex perspective.
But even in a broader sense, you can learn a lesson, don't judge anybody because you never know their circumstances anyway.
That's true. So we're not going to judge him. But even though we're
Yeah.
not going to judge him, I judge my behavior. What can I learn? Someone does something wrong. So there's one question is, should I judge him positively or favorably? Judge him favorably. He's doing it because of his circumstances. He's doing it for whatever reason. But should I be like him? Of course not. For me, the takeaway for me is negative. The takeaway for me is that behavior is negative. If the question is, how do I judge him? Oh, he has a good reason. He's justified because of the pressures he's under. But does that mean I should do the same in that circumstances? No, I have the benefit of more wisdom or more opportunity, and therefore I should not learn from him. But again, that doesn't take away from the ability to judge the other guy favorably. And yet, when you expound, when you take it away from that person and say, what's the lesson to me? Oh, I could say, oh, that's negative. So we could do both. We have that sophistication to be able to do both. One more detail. So only the Rebbe could do this. The greatest praise to Noach, if we learn from Noach and say, the Torah says Noach is a righteous person. Noach didn't pray for his generation. So the takeaway for us is we don't have to care about other people. We don't have to worry about the spiritual welfare of the other people. If that's the takeaway that we're going to learn from Noach, that's no praise to Noach. That's going to be derogatory for Noach. In other words, the fact that we're looking at Noach's story and taking away the opposite message is the greatest praise to Noach. Now when Noach's happy. Noach's saying, now learn from my circumstance. And in some sense, you're liberating me from learning from my situation. In other words, in this case, that emulating would not be the compliment. That's not what he wants, right? So this is very profound, I think, because what's really telling us, and the Rebbe did this in many cases. There's famous stories in the Talmud where the Talmud is critical about certain people, and the Rebbe reinterpreted those stories and say, what's the lesson for us? The lesson for us is a positive one, and we believe we could spiritually add to that person's life when we are learning something good from a negative person or a negative circumstance. We're actually liberating that situation and bringing them back to holiness and correcting their mistake. Because if they made a mistake or they had an imperfection and I learned from that imperfection, then I'm healing it. Because even though Noach did not pray for the people of his generation, but he taught us to pray for the people of his generation. So by extension, we are liberating Noach and saying that Noach's story teaches us to pray for other people. So we're almost liberating Noach. So this is more of a mystical addition, but the idea is that when you reinterpret that story and you learn from that person's life, you are actually giving that person a sort of a second chance, and you're liberating the imperfections that he had, and he is being corrected, tikkun, being corrected through you. So that's level 2. That's the second takeaway. The first takeaway is you have to differentiate between judging the person based on their circumstances and based on their generation, and do that favorably, because the Mishnah says judge a person favorably. On the other hand, what's the lesson to yourself? Be much more critical, because you could say, we know more, we know better, we could learn from that experience. And from our perspective, if we were to duplicate that behavior, it would have been negative. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short. You want to hear more about Noach and the Parsha, we'll come back tomorrow, God willing, 10 o'clock. But this, I felt like we did 40 minutes on a little bit deeper analysis on the Rebbe's perspective on Noach. I thought that's a good exercise. So thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Any comments, questions, jokes, politics? I guess I entered the political arena, so I have to let other people respond. So I'm willing to take critique, even political arena. If it gets too heated, I'm just going to sign off. No, I'm kidding. But
I have a question about last week's Parsha.
Yes.
I don't know that there's an answer to this, but I was wondering, there's so many different aspects to Bereshit, so many different stories, so many different messages. Why wouldn't the rabbis have separated them more? That's
a good question. In other words, you have so many powerful stories. I could make a full Parsha creation, full Parsha tree of knowledge, for Parsha Cain and Hevel, for a Parsha, the generations of Cain and Hevel till Noach. That's an excellent question. And if you're trying to cram everything into 1 week, it becomes very frustrating. I don't know the answer. What I would guess is based on what the Hasidic interpretation explains, that I would say 2 things. First of all, I would say, in a practical level, how do I say this nicely? The Torah is trying on a basic practical level. The Torah is trying to get to Abraham as quick as possible. Okay, so if you look at the pattern, whenever the Torah says a story, a narrative, because it has to say it, it's going to say it relatively quickly and then go to the main actor. You see it with Esav and Jacob. Quickly, the Torah gives you a list of all Esav's generations, and then you have 4 portions about Jacob. So you see this pattern. So the short pattern is I guess the simplistic answer is we're trying to get to Abraham as quick as possible. I think that's the short answer. I think that's the short answer, but it's not the complete answer. The complete answer is all the stories in the portion of Bereshit follow the same model. And Noach begins a separate model. And therefore, the division of the portions has to be exactly where it is. And the portion of Bereshit would be where an extension of the creation from Hashem. In other words, top down. And we did this a little bit in the JLI. Top down model, meaning Hashem creates, and the people are not, how do I say this? The people are not required to do anything. Their job is to tune in to the flow that comes from above. And that's why the top-down model is destined to failure, and it's going to fail as it did. When you get to the second parsha, what's the first thing you see? God tells Noach, you need to build the ark. You need to participate in the process of rebuilding the earth, of first saving the earth and then rebuilding the earth. And Noach does so, this with some challenges, because also after the flood, God says, okay, now you start rebuilding, and it's very difficult to rebuild, much easier to survive than to rebuild, and therefore he's not able to rebuild fully. But the model changes. Now God says, okay, I see that when the people get all the gifts from above and not much is required of them, at the end of the day, they're not going to appreciate what they have. And at the end of the day, they're not going to be able to internalize the goodness. So we need to start a second model. And the second model is Noach the human being has to participate in the saving and rebuilding the earth. And if that's the way you divide, if that's the way you're looking at it, if you see Genesis, Bereshit as one model and Noach has a second model, by the way, Abraham, the third parsha, is merging of the both, but that's already more, that takes more time to explain how in the Hasidic interpretation, there's Kabbalistic interpretation, there's above to below, that's Bereshit, then there's below to above is Noach, and then sort of the combination of doing both is what Abraham is about. Abraham receives God's word, God's revelation, but he also works by himself to better his circumstances, to spread the oneness of Hashem, to go to battle when he needs to, but he's also in tune to the revelation from above. So if you want to think of the first 3 portions of the Torah, it's really Chesed, Gevura, Tiferet, top down, giving from above. Then Noach is the below, lifting himself up. In other words, top down, bottom up. And the third parsha is Tiferet, is the blending of them both. So if you're looking at it from that perspective, then all the portions of Bereshit are really telling you the same story. And the same story is the limitation of the top-down model.
Thank you.
That's the story in short. We did it in the JLI for a few weeks, but that's the story in short. Yes, Vicky.
I just learned one more lesson. I don't know, probably it's all included. How you view your not opponent, but other interpreters of Torah. That even if something, when they disagree, you still see that kernel of truth when they actually don't disagree. They actually meant for us to learn the lesson, and they don't judge him, right? So that's the main lesson.
If they're wrong, there's something. Even if it's wrong, there's something I can learn from that. It's a question of what can I learn from your wrong perspective.
It's not the wrong perspective. So he doesn't even view it as a wrong perspective.
Right.
He's trying. It's totally Aaron's approach, and it's beautiful.
Yeah, that is very nice. Thank you. Thank you. A wonderful day, everybody. And yeah, so that's the bottom line. The bottom line is that we have to judge people favorably, but that doesn't mean that you have to be like everybody. We have to say, okay, so what can we learn from that story, and what can we improve over the other circumstances around us? That's the story in short. Wonderful day, and only good things.
Thank you. Chodesh Tov.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Be well.